Purposely. Your life, God's purpose. Listen at onpurposely.com.
I've been a Christian my whole life. I became a Christian when I was a little kid. I grew up in a Christian home. I have seen miracles, and I think I'm probably not alone. When things are going good, you don't make God as important as you should. I wasn't as devoted as I should have been. But this experience was something that really, really changed me.
We've all experienced it. You run into a friend from the past, but there's something different. They are changed. Maybe there is a calm where there once was a storm. Maybe there is gentleness instead of harshness. There's a new passion, a new life. What changed? Welcome to Brought Back to Life, a podcast where we explore stories of ordinary transformation.
Hey, producer Luke here. I'm so excited to share my brave coworker Heidi's journey of finding new purpose in life after a near-death experience with COVID. And don't forget to listen all the way to the end for another insightful testimony from our sponsor, UGM.
Hi, my name is Heidi Martin, and this is my journey through COVID that brought me back to life. I just want to start off by saying I was listening to a different podcast, and it was a Christian podcast, and they were just talking about, they had like 5 kids, and how they told the older kids the story of their life, and they assumed it would trickle down to the younger kids. And then they found out that that wasn't happening. The moral was, keep telling your story, because you think people have heard it, you think maybe your friends have heard it, your family has heard it, but maybe they haven't. And, and my story is really about giving God glory. And so I hope that accomplishes that, because that's really my goal. So back last year, 2021, very memorable day, August 7th. It was a Saturday morning. My husband had COVID, and he was sick for a couple weeks, and he has autoimmune diseases, so we were more worried about him. I wasn't feeling good for about 10 days, but I'm not usually the person who's that sick, so I was just resting and thought, I'll just get better, it'll go away. We were monitoring our oxygen levels, and mine were staying mid to high 90s, so that was good. And so we went to bed that Friday night. We're both sick. And Saturday morning, it's like 11 o'clock in the morning, which is very unusual for me. I'm a morning person. And even if I'm not feeling good, I'm not in bed till 11 o'clock. And the next thing I know, it's all a blur, but the next thing I remember is my sister is standing in my bedroom. And I'm thinking, where did she come from? How did she even get in my house? I'm just really confused. And she has my daughter-in-law, on the phone, on speakerphone, who's a nurse. And she was a COVID nurse at Harborview in Seattle during 2020. And so she saw the worst of the worst. And so the next thing I know, they're taking my oxygen levels, and they had dropped overnight to 72, which is drastic. And pretty much you better get to the hospital, or else, you could probably just sleep and die in your sleep at that point. And so I'm completely out of it because my oxygen levels are so low, my brain is not functioning properly. And so this I believe is the first miracle, because she didn't call us first. She lives about 40 minutes away. And she had just heard that I hadn't really had food or anything for about a week, and I was taking minimal fluids. And she knew we had kind of been sick. And she listened to the Holy Spirit, who said, get in your car and go get Heidi. And I'm so thankful for her, because my husband couldn't have done it, because he was also sick, and he wasn't really functioning, properly either. So she shows up and takes her 45 minutes to get me downstairs and into the car, because I have no energy. I don't really remember any of that. I remember getting to the ER and lying on the bed in there, and they were checking my vitals and all that kind of stuff. And they had put an oxygen mask on me. That was August 7th. And so for about a week, I was in the ER. And honestly, my brain just couldn't even function, like where I was or why I wasn't at home. None of that really was in my brain. I was just like, I guess this is just where I need to be. And I really believe God is protecting my mind through all of my hospital stay, because I wasn't like, I want to go home. When can I get out of here? I didn't even think that way. And I know that that's not normal. So anyway, so about a week I was in the ER. A week later, they moved me to the ICU because I needed more help with breathing. And the ICU had better equipment and better staffing to give me more attention, more one-on-one attention. And it started out as just a precautionary move. The next day, I was moved onto a BiPAP, which is a breathing machine like a mask. I wasn't able to be moved at all or be moved without my oxygen levels dropping drastically, even if they tried to turn me on my side or on my stomach, because they want you to lay on your stomach. I never did lay on my stomach because I couldn't do it. So they would lay me on my side. I was on 100% oxygen, double masked, and 40 liters a minute being pumped into me. 60 liters is the max you can have pumped into you. So I'm getting up there. I ended up with a double lung infection, viral and bacterial. So they started treating me with antibiotics. And this is when anxiety started to kick in, and which was something very foreign to me. I've never been an anxious person, never been depressed, none of that. They were giving me anxiety meds to help. Then the next day, my vitals started to stabilize. And all this time, there's no visitors. I haven't really talked to my husband that much, maybe a video call here and there with the nurse's help. Texting, all that, all out the window. I just did not have any energy for any of that. So I had to tell my husband at the very beginning, please tell people to quit texting me. And so we would have a point person, my husband, and then we had Roger at my office was also a point person. So then that next day, the vitals started to stabilize. My nurse called my daughter-in-law, Marissa, she's the nurse, called her phone so I could have a Zoom call with my family. This was the first time we had seen each other since I was admitted. So now we're 10 days in, and it's the first time I'm seeing my family. My youngest son and his wife and my granddaughter were not able to get to my house in time for this call. And my husband tried really hard to get everybody there. The next day, my husband gets a call. You got to remember, I'm starting to stabilize. But now the next day, they're calling my husband, telling him they're gonna put me on the ventilator, which was a surprise because they thought things were maybe starting to be going well. Because I had maxed out 3 breathing machines, and I was still unable to maintain a safe oxygen level. My husband asked if they could wait 45 minutes so all of my families could gather to see me before I went on the ventilator. Sorry. So they did wait the 45 minutes. My husband told my granddaughter, who was 9 at the time, and we're super close, and to look in my eyes when she saw me on the video, because she would see me smiling because I'd have a breathing mask on my face. So look at my eyes. But quite the opposite happened. I looked terrified, and she started to cry. At this point, my family didn't know if this was the last time they would ever see me, but they were praying along with many, many others. The doctors think that I had a bacterial infection in my lung that had been there for maybe even years, which made me more susceptible to COVID. And so after I was put on the ventilator, they were able to x-ray my lungs and discovered I had air around my lungs, and that was adding additional pressure. The next day, after I was on the ventilator, they had to put 2 chest tubes in me to help release that air pressure. So I had two chest tubes put in. My white blood cell count started to trend down, which meant the antibiotics were starting to work. I had asked my family at the beginning, which I don't remember asking, but I had asked them for picture boards to put in my room. And so my other daughter-in-law, Rachel, had made 3 picture boards. One had my family with pictures and they all wrote stuff on it. The other one had my work family with pictures and they all wrote stuff. And then another one was just an encouraging verse. And I don't remember what that is at the moment. But so I was on the ventilator, and at the hospital in Bellingham, they don't put you in a coma. They put you under, but you can still wake up and then you go back to sleep. So I've heard that that's a little bit better way to deal with it. So I would wake up I don't remember this at all, but the nurses told me later. I would wake up, I would point to my granddaughter's picture, and I would smile, and I'd go back to sleep. So I told her afterwards, I said, Ariana, you helped get me through this. You and God helped get me through this. So then the next day, the doctors landed on a baseline, and they're not going to make any adjustments for a few days unless it's required. So I'm basically just hanging out on that ventilator. And 3 days in a row, I had incremental improvement. My fever came down, and my white blood cell count was almost normal. They started seeing increased lung capacity, and my lungs were starting to loosen up. So a couple days later, my nurse called my husband again because I really wanted to see my family. My husband was able to gather everybody for a Zoom call, and my eyes were closed, but I would nod my head in response. I couldn't talk or anything because I had, obviously the ventilator down my throat and into my lungs. And we ended up the call by singing Jesus Loves Me, which I guess I had requested they sing every day, probably to calm and reassure my granddaughter and myself. And a little bit of medical jargon here. Each oxygen machine has an F102 setting, which controls the concentration percentage. The air that we breathe every day is 21% oxygen. The machine can go up to 100%. I was able to max out the first 3 machines all the way to 100%, which is why I was moved to the ventilator. My body was having to try and do the breathing, and the ventilator was able just to do that for me, so I didn't have to work so hard because I couldn't do it. There was just no way. I started the ventilator at 80%, which did not leave a lot of room to go up. The first day I was at 80%, the second day 70 to 80, the third day 70 to 75, and so on. I was trending down, which was good. Once I could reach 21% oxygen, I could be taken off of the ventilator and work my way back through the same 3 machines that I had gone through to get to the ventilator. August 25th, 7 days now on the ventilator. When I was put on the ventilator, I was in the high severity range for mortality. But after 7 days, I moved into the mild range. I still had high anxiety. Just going back for a second here, my daughter-in-law, who's the nurse, Marissa, in 2020, when COVID was new and we didn't know a whole lot about it, she had put 100 people on the ventilator at Harborview and only took 1 person off. The rest died. And so she kept telling my husband, at least I was a year later, so they had more knowledge, but she kept telling my husband and my son, as long as she doesn't go on the ventilator, we're going to be okay. So when I went on the ventilator, she freaked out a little bit, obviously. But my husband and my oldest son, Taylor, are researchers. So they started doing tons of research and figured out, okay, there's a good chance she's in a good category because of her age, and she doesn't have a lot of pre-existing conditions, and trying to find the hope, right? I mean, they obviously know God is our hope, but they're analytical. So they want to find out the numbers. So August 26th, vitals continued to move in the right direction, so much so that they decided to do a breathing test in the next 24 hours. They would turn off my ventilator for 30 minutes and see how I did. My white blood cells jumped back up. August 28th is 10 days on the ventilator. I was finally taken off and only using 6 liters of oxygen, which is amazing. 6 liters is like, in the grand scheme, is nothing, right? I mean, it's still oxygen. You still need it, but which is another miracle. Doctors are now telling my family they'll probably keep me in the hospital another 2 weeks. So starting August 30th, I still have to go back through those 3 breathing machines, and I was on number 2. I was extremely weak and disoriented and hadn't been able to take a step yet. Still major anxiety. September 1st, I was moved out of ICU into general care. I had been using a feeding tube down my throat still and not able to swallow, so I had to have everything thickened. And because of the ventilator, it had paralyzed one of my vocal cords. And so I had 0 voice. I literally couldn't even hardly whisper. And that made swallowing impossible because your vocal cords have to smack together to be able to swallow. Otherwise, things could go in the wrong direction, like can go into your lungs or whatever. So my doctor was great. he actually had one of the ENTs come in and scope my throat and confirmed that it was paralyzed. And before I left the hospital, he was able to come in and do a procedure on my throat and inject that vocal cord, which made it so it was more permanent. So the right vocal cord had something to smack against so I could swallow, because they weren't going to let me go home until I could swallow. And now I want to go home. Now I'm starting to realize I want to get out of here. So September 4th, I stood and I walked a few steps. And at this point, you have to remember, I am completely dependent on oxygen, and I am very panicky. Like if the oxygen isn't on my face immediately, like if they change tubes or masks or anything, I am very scared. And so, and I really didn't sleep hardly at all in the hospital, except for when they had me sleeping with drugs. I'm still dealing with anxiety, but I finally asked them to quit giving me anxiety meds and sleeping pills since they weren't working anyways. And I just didn't want that in my system. September 7th, I was moved out of the COVID unit. Thank you, Jesus. Because in the COVID unit, everybody looks like they're wearing a hazmat suit. No visitors. You feel like an alien. They were super nice and everything like that, but you just feel like an alien. And it just, not a good place to be. Anyways, so then, so when I got moved out of the COVID unit, I had people that had regular nurses and doctors' uniforms on. And sometimes and most of them weren't even wearing masks at the time. And I felt like a human again, and some of them would even give me hugs and things like that. And I did go through a phase where when I was so anxious, anytime somebody came into my room, a doctor, somebody even who was cleaning my room, a nurse, anybody, I would ask them to please rub my arm. And I just needed that human touch so bad. And so most of them were so kind and would literally sit and just rub my arm. And later on, when I got home and I was reading some articles about COVID, that was actually one of the things that someone said, and one of the doctors said in the article. It's like, people want them to rub their arm. And I thought, what an interesting thing that I would ask for that. So, and every time a nurse came into my room, I would always ask them, do you believe in prayer? And sometimes I had to write that down on a piece of paper because I couldn't talk. And if they said yes, I asked if they would pray for me. And I wanted them to know, I believe in God and I want you to pray for me, please. Because I believe in healing and I believe in miracles. And my one son, Taylor, the one that's married to the nurse, they actually live down south in Bothell. And he was so great. He came up because he works from home. He came up and probably spent 3 to 4 nights at our house every single week, even when I was in the hospital, to help my husband out, because he didn't know if he was going to have a wife anymore. Is my wife coming home? I believe she's coming home, but I don't know what the plan is. And, we've been married a long time. We've been married 35 years at that point. And we just didn't know anything different. There's always been the two of us and our kids, right? So, and another thing my husband had read was a lot of people that went through COVID came out with basically PTSD. And they were super afraid to go outside. They were super afraid to get sick and many other things. And it's a miracle I literally have none of that. I came home and I was like, even though I had a long recovery, but I didn't have the fear. I had zero fear. And my husband was actually more worried about that. So, but anyways, before I came home, they had, because I had a feeding tube. And so they actually took that out, which I was so thankful. That was probably one of the worst things. And they put a feeding tube in my stomach so my husband could feed me. And so when my husband came to pick me up, it was pretty interesting because I had that throat procedure. And so I had to pass the swallow test. So I passed the swallow test on a Tuesday morning. They let me go home Tuesday afternoon. So this is 37 days in the hospital. The nurses were crying. I was crying because I was so happy to go home. My husband picked me up. He was in full dress clothes. huge bouquet of flowers, the whole works. I mean, it was very sweet, and that made, I think, everybody cry more. So, and my son was laughing because he said Dad was speeding all the way to the hospital because he was so excited to come get you. So, but one of the cool things that happened while I was in the hospital that I heard about was we live in a small town up in Linden. We have a pretty visible house because we're on a corner. And my husband and my two sons were at home one of the days that I was in the hospital, and they look out the window and they see like 20 plus people all of a sudden coming onto our front lawn. And they're like, what in the heck is going on around here, right? So they go out there, and these people are, some of them we know, some of them are just strangers, and they're all there to have an impromptu prayer meeting for me, which was pretty powerful. And so my sons and my husband all went out and joined them. And there was a prayer meeting right on my front lawn in Linden. And we live, like I said, in a pretty visible area, so I'm sure a lot of people saw that driving by. That's pretty cool. So, and another cool thing that happened when I was in the hospital too was when I couldn't talk and I was so anxious and I just needed to hear someone pray for me or anything, I would call Roger and Linda Burke from my office. And I would just put him on speakerphone and no questions asked. He would, and then we're talking like 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. And they would literally just start praying. And it was kind of funny because my husband and my son were like, well, why did you call them and not call us? And but they figured it out because they said if I called them, they would ask me questions. Like, what do you need? What's wrong? You know, like normal family stuff, right? But I knew Roger and Linda would literally just pray. They wouldn't ask me questions. They would just pray. So I called them quite a few times because I just needed someone to pray. And I had a lot of Christian music playing in my room at night. So whoever walked in there also heard that. So, but I think one of the things that really changed me was because I've been a Christian my whole life. I became a Christian when I was a little kid. I grew up in a Christian home. I have seen miracles, and I think I'm probably not alone. When things are going good, you don't make God as important as you should. I wasn't as devoted as I should have been. But this experience was something that really, really changed me. And I take God more serious. And I definitely put him first. Instead of making him equal with my family, he's now first, and my family is now second. And that has changed how I look at everything. And I would always say when I was a kid up through adulthood, Jesus, don't come now. I want to get married. Jesus, don't come now. I want to have kids. Don't come yet because I want to have grandkids. There was always something that I was waiting for. But now I'm like, okay, God, you can come anytime you want. I'm ready. I'm ready to go home anytime you want. Doesn't mean I don't love my family dearly. I love my family dearly. But I know they'll be okay. And God has a plan. And I want to be part of God's plan. And I want to do his will. And I was never really an emotional person before this happened. But now I'm very emotional. And I'm emotional about the right things, not the wrong things. I used to get emotional when I was really mad, or I was really sick, or frustrated, or any of that. But most of that stuff now doesn't really faze me. I'm like, in the big scheme, that's small potatoes. It doesn't really matter. Life will go on. We don't need to freak out over that situation. And I've turned into a hugger. I didn't used to be a hugger. So now I'm a hugger. Anyways, and I want people to know when they come into my office or they come into my house that I love God. You'll see it. You'll see it in my office. You'll see it in my house. I hope you see it in my life. I hope you see it the way I treat people, the way I talk, the way I live. And I hope nobody else has to go through this. But I don't know why God spared me, because I know there was a couple of people that I knew that were in the hospital similar time to me with similar situations that didn't make it. So I don't know why God chose to spare me, but God's God. And I just, I'm thankful that I'm here. And that's my story.
Heidi, thank you so much for continuing to tell your story Through you, we know how a relationship with God can give us life and sometimes even save it. UGM has been in the hands and feet for God for years and years. Here's just one story about how they've impacted a life. Take a listen.
Helping the lost become found with Seattle's Union Gospel Mission. Seattle's Union Gospel Mission doesn't just provide food and shelter. They offer a path out of homelessness, giving men and women a safe place to recover from addiction and start on the path toward a new life.
My childhood was really rough. I was abandoned by my mom and dad, and I was abused at a young age, and that caused a lot of mental issues for me. When I was 23, I discovered meth, and it ruined my life. My kids were taken away from me. For 5 years, I was homeless. I was pleading with God to save me, and He brought me to the mission. I received intense trauma therapy and classes to heal my inner child. I didn't think I could ever reach this point in my life, but with God's love and the mission, here I am. I am clean and sober, and I have a loving and stable relationship with my kids.
Even when it seems impossible to see, hope can be found. Local men and women in our area desperately need a fresh start, and that's what they find at Seattle's Union Gospel Mission. From learning to trust again, to that first hot meal, to a recovery program, and then job training. The mission's recovery programs offer counseling, case management, chemical dependency classes, and so much more.
And grace will lead me home.
To hear more, volunteer, or donate, visit ugm.org.